Hello, everyone. This week we'll be learning about cannabis, which is covered in Chapter 9. Cannabis has been around for a really long time, way before it could be recorded in history. And China has used it around 4000 or since 4000 BCE. And eventually it widespread to Southeast Asia and India around 1500 to 1000 BC. And then it spread to Muslim world and Africa during the Middle Ages and arrived in America around 1545, and it became a major crop till this day for over 200 years. And so um, cannabis comes in different forms, and the hemp version of cannabis was used as fiber to make rope and cloth, oil, medicine, and the other types of cannabis, which are marijuana. That's how we know cannabis was used as for its psychological and medicinal effects. And so they had claimed that the use of cannabis made you crave sweets and made you feel high, and also contributed to the feeling of being creative. And they also noticed a decrease in sex drive. In some individuals, it would produce insanity, I guess, or maybe like intense psychological effects. And it would also cause an unmotivational syndrome or amotivational syndrome, which means that you are just not motivated to do anything. Now in the United States, adults use it widely, so about 21.9 million. And these are statistics from 2002 to 2014, which increased by 10 million to 31.9 million. And now that we're in 2021, I'm imagining that it's probably increased another 10 million um, users. And so adolescents are the ones that use it widely as well, as young as in eighth grade. So 5.4% of users are eighth graders, and 14% are 10th graders, and high schoolers about 22.5%, which is around like one in every four individuals. Um, there's been a decrease in the prevalence of synthetic marijuana, which is K2 and spice. And so we'll talk about that later. Legalization, and this is actually the most current information, has been more widespread in the United States. It's been more accepted. And so 37 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized the medicinal use of marijuana. And some of those have also legalized the recreational use. The 17 states have declared that it's can be used for medicinal and recreational, just like alcohol is used recreationally. So it means that you could, as long as you're of age, you can purchase it for your personal uses. The DEA has petitioned the removal of the Schedule 1 classification. And so, if you remember in one of the first lectures, we talked about the schedule of drugs and how Schedule 1 is basically the most addictive, the ones that are illegal. And so now, and maybe it's not even a Schedule 1 anymore. Actually, I should have looked that information up. But the DEA had petitioned to remove it as a Schedule 1 classification. Um, and there's more of a relaxed policy for growing cannabis for federally approved research. There are several different types of cannabis strains. There's cannabis sativa, which is more tall and woody, just like what you see here. And then there's cannabis indica, which is a shorter plant, and it has the highest THC concentration. And you also have a hybrid, which is basically a mix of the two. And there's also cannabis ruderalis, which is a shorter plant and a lower growth period, but yet it has a low potency in THC, but more higher in CBDs, which we'll talk about what THC and CBD means in a few slides from now. Sativa is more of the daytime use. It's more of what people call a head high. And so it creates more alertness. It has an uplifting and euphoric feeling. It increases creativity, energy, focus, and can be used as an antidepressant. And by the way, I have links to videos here which have interesting information about the differences between sativa and indica. So if you want to learn more about it, feel free to watch any of these YouTube video links. And indica is more of a body high. Um, it's for nighttime use. It's more of like a sedative. It's relaxing. It's also an appetite stimulant, which makes people more hungry. It helps people sleep and relieves pain, and also helps with stress and anxiety. So these are what people claim, the effects are. But the effects can range, and also depends on what type of genetic background you have. So people who are more prone to like schizophrenia or any other type of mental disorder can have very different, or the marijuana can affect them very differently. THC and CBD are both found in cannabis, and those are the active forms of the molecule. However, in the plant, it's actually tetrahydrocannabinolic acid and cannabidiol acid. And so it is not turned into THC and CBD until it is heated. And so that's why some people smoke it. So when you um, put fire on the flower, that heat itself helps decarboxylate it. That's what it's called. And so that converts the THC acid, so A stands for the acid, it basically removes the acid and turns it into the regular THC form without the acid. And that's the same thing with CBD. And so the way to get the maximum THC and CBD from a flower is to heat it to a specific degrees, and that's anywhere from 230 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And so when a person is smoking it, they're not necessarily gaining all of the THC. They also get some of the forms of THCA, which is the part with the acid, which is not active. Same thing with the CBDs. THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. And it's interesting because it's similar to an endogenous. And by the way, endogenous means something that is natural, that your own brain makes. And so THC is similar to the endogenous form of anandamide. And so anandamide is a chemical, a neurotransmitter, we've learned about it before, that is made by our brain. And it's only made on demand. So it's not like always there stored in vesicles. It's only made when you need it. And it's an interesting neurotransmitter because it just doesn't work the same as the other types of neurotransmitters. Even the way that they stimulate neurons. This is just a side note, but it's called a retrograde neurotransmitter, meaning that instead of stimulating the postsynaptic neuron, it stimulates the presynaptic neuron. And so it kind of works backward. It's kind of weird. But that's just a side note. But anyway, the reason why THC is so effective is because it somewhat mimics a natural neurotransmitter that our brain makes, and it also partially binds to the same receptors that anandamide binds to. Out of CBD and THC, THC is the one that's responsible for most of the psychological effects, and so that euphoria, the high, what the way that it affects your brain is mostly caused by THC. And even like some of the side effects like paranoia and things like that, that's all because of THC. Cannabidiol, which is basically the other active ingredient, the other molecule found in marijuana, which also binds to the same types of receptors that anandamide binds to, is second to THC when it comes to volume. And so usually THC has a higher volume, but it does depend on what species of plant. And so marijuana tends to have most of the THC, whereas hemp, it's still a form of cannabis, but it's different. Hemp is actually used more to make like fibers and textiles and ropes and things like that. Contains more CBD than THC. And so, but cannabinol also has effects on the body, but it's mostly like on the peripheral part of the body. So it doesn't stimulate the central nervous system as much as it stimulates the peripheral, which means the rest of your body. And so it's been shown to have analgesic, anti-inflammatory, and anti-anxiety properties without the psychoactive effects. So you can use this or you can take this without feeling high or stoned, like the way THC makes you feel. While high THC strains often tout levels over 20%, CBD levels are usually around 4%, and that's still considered to be a high amount of CBD. And it's also been known to treat forms of epilepsy. And so epilepsy is when an individual has a lot of convulsions, seizures, and so it's been used to treat that. The way that cannabis works is by basically hijacking the endocannabinoid system. And so we talked about this already, what endocannabinoids are. So one type of endocannabinoid is anandamide. This is the neurotransmitter that your own brain makes. This is your natural neurotransmitters, which bind onto CB1 and CB2 receptors. And remember, receptors are the ones that are found on neurons. And receptors are the ones that tell neurons to either fire and stimulate. So, they talk to the rest of the brain. So it can either fire it and make it activate in a more frequency, or it can decrease the frequency. And THC, CBD, CBN, which are all the compounds that are found in the plants. And there's also synthetic versions of THC, so you can make this in the lab. They all bind to the endocannabinoid receptors, which are CB1s and CB2s. The endocannabinoid system consists of receptors that are located throughout the body. And so CB1 receptors are more concentrated in the area of the brain, the central nervous system. Whereas CB2 receptors, you can find them in the central nervous system, but they're mostly located in the peripheral nervous system. And the way that cannabis produces its psychoactive effects is by binding to receptors in several brain sites. And so those brain sites are the basal ganglia, which affects motor performance. And remember, we said motor performance is basically your muscular movements. Same as cerebellum, which is known to affect your balance. You know how well your spatial relationship is to your surroundings and how you can balance when you walk. It affects that area too. It affects the hippocampus, which is the area of memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in attention, memory, and concentration. THC and CBD differ in their receptor actions. THC is considered a partial agonist, meaning that it has the same effect as anandamide when it comes to binding to CB1 and CB2 receptors. So that means that it can bind to all of the receptors that are located in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Where CBD works differently, and so CBD is actually a partial antagonist at CB1 receptors, which is why it doesn't have the same psychotic effects as THC. THC are the ones that can precipitate the psychotic reactions, like the feeling of high, the euphoria, the alertness, the attentiveness, hunger, things like that. Whereas CBD may actually block that action. And so some people prefer CBD so that they don't have that psychotic effect. It's just more of like a body high. In higher doses, CBD can function as a serotonin agonist, meaning that it doesn't bind to the serotonin receptors, from my understanding. What it does is that it allows more serotonin to be around to stimulate neurons, which affects your mood. And it also stimulates other receptors in the same way, including the endogenous cannabinoids. And so it actually helps the anandamide. So remember, we said that was one of the neurotransmitters. It helps anandamide to better bind onto the cannabinoid receptors. And so it's sort of like a helper of other neurotransmitters. All right, so let's talk about the pharmacokinetics of THC and CBD. And so remember, we said that pharmacokinetics are ADME, which is administration, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And so let's start with administration. And so there are several routes of administration. It can be smoked, which is absorbed rapidly and completely into the bloodstream. The estimate range is from 5 to 60% of available THC absorbed into the body once it's smoked. It can also be vaped, which is similar to the e-cigarettes. It's like a device that heats up oils, like hash oil. And vaping, it's administered in the same way that the way that you smoke it, but in higher concentration. And so, at least 60% of the THC is absorbed into the body. It can also be orally ingested, which means that it can be, you can put it in like foods like cookies, candies, and things like that, even drinks. The onset is delayed simply because it has to go through your digestive system. And so remember, when you eat something, it has to go through the stomach, through the small, through the large intestine, and then it has to diffuse out of the membrane tissues, go through the liver and whatnot. And because of all of those processes, that's called first pass metabolism, it may reduce the potency by 2/3, and so you won't end up with as much THC and CBDs in the body. However, the effects last way longer since it's slowly released. And if you eat food with it, it may produce more THC since THC can bind onto fatty substances. THC itself is actually non-polar. It's similar to fats that are non-polar, and so it can interact and bind with those easier. And it's questionable to how much THC is found in orally ingested products, just because I guess it's hard to quantify. So once THC reaches into the system, it is taken out of the blood quickly and moves into fatty tissue. That's actually where it's stored. And like I said, THC is non-polar, and so that's why it easily interacts with fats. 25 to 30% of a single dose may remain in fatty tissue for a week, and continuous doses may accumulate in fat and may take up to 2 weeks to leave after the use stops. And so the delay tends to form a type of reverse tolerance to the drug. And eventually it escapes, through your urine once it's passed. And so THC can be found in the urine as carboxy THC, which is slowly excreted. And infrequent users will test positive anywhere from 1 to 3 days, but chronic smokers will test positive anywhere from 7 to 21 days, and so it lasts a lot longer. And so there's little or no correlation between the presence of carboxy THC in urine and the presence of a pharmacologically significant amount of the THC in the blood. And so just because they find it in your urine, that doesn't have there's no way to tell how much is actually found in your blood. But eventually, the THC, it's slowly released from the fat cells and makes it into the kidneys and then is excreted out of the urine. And so that is the way that it is expelled from the body. The physiological effects of cannabis, and so the way that it affects your physiology, is through the cardiovascular system. And so some people have bloodshot eyes and pupillary dilation. Also, heart rate increase. The respiration, there's no definitive evidence of lung function effects from cannabis use, even though you smoke it. Although it can cause phlegm in some cases. It's for the immune system. It can be like an immunosuppression. This is associated with long-term marijuana use, and so immunosuppression actually means that it brings your immune system down. But this is again for chronic users. It affects appetite, nausea, vomiting, and gastrointestinal disorders. And so for some people, it can increase the appetite and have an anti-inflammatory effect. And so in that case, it is used in some pharmaceuticals like nabilone and dronabinol. The psychological effects are different, and so it's subjective. It varies by the amount that is taken, and it even varies from person to person. And so For the most part, it causes an increased sense of well being, mild euphoria, relaxation, and anxiety relief. And psychomotor effects are impairments in coordination, perception, reaction time, and attention. The functional effects may impair performance of driving, working, or at school. And so, even though some states have legalized cannabis for recreational use, it's still illegal to drive under the influence of cannabis just because it has an effect on your psychomotor abilities. And it increases the risk of being mixed with alcohol because of its effect. And so people tend to use alcohol and marijuana simultaneously um, because of how it affects the body. Another common and probably well known side effect of marijuana is the impairment of memories. And this has to do with the CB1 receptors that are found in the hippocampus. And so there's no real evidence on how this is done or no complete understanding of how this is done. But it's known that marijuana can cause this thing called memory disrupting effect, meaning that it becomes difficult to create short term and long term memories. And also, you can kind of forget what you're doing in the middle of an activity. And it is believed this is because there is low blood flow to the brain. It also is known to affect a person's attention, and so they have a shorter attention span. And in some cases, it also affects a person's performance, and their motivation is reduced, meaning that they just have a less drive to want to do things. It makes them feel kind of lazy or lethargic. All right, I know that we focused on more of the negative side effects of marijuana, but there's also pharmacological implications like medicinal uses. And in some cases, it's been used for neuroprotection, meaning that it protects neurons after brain injury. And so what it does is that it reduces the inflammatory responses. It reduces like the immune responses that causes inflammation. It's also been used in patients who have cancer because cancer, can cause people to have more nausea, vomiting, and pain. And so marijuana is used to treat the nausea and vomiting. It basically alleviates that, and also hunger. It increases hunger, and it may have some anti-tumor CBD properties, meaning that it can have an effect on slowing down tumors. Um, it has been used for glaucoma, although it's not recommended to treat glaucoma, according to the American Academy Ophthalmology. Let's switch gears to tolerance, withdrawal, and dependence. And so tolerance does occur when a person smokes, and over time, they will need to smoke more to have the same effect, which is what tolerance means. It means that you need to have more just to have the same effect that you had the first time. Withdrawal symptoms are also noticeable and more noticeable for chronic users. And so some of the withdrawal symptoms includes irritability, anxiety, craving, disrupted sleep, anger, aggression, depressed mood, decreased appetite, and weight loss. And this depends on how dependent they are to marijuana. And so withdrawal symptoms can begin anywhere from 49 hours and last up to 2 days to 10 days or longer, again, depending on how dependent a person is. 1 in 10 individuals will become dependent or can become dependent. And a common reason for, this is a common reason for a drug treatment program and admission. And so there actually is a drug treatment program for this, for cannabis dependence. Cannabis dependence is categorized as cannabis use disorder, which can be diagnosed as mild, moderate, or severe. And so some of the areas of concern and why people should be treated is because they may do certain things that may impact their lifestyle. For example, they tend to drive more under the influence, and that can be mixed with alcohol as well, which is dangerous to yourself and to others. It can potentially cause a person to just not perform well in different areas, like at work or at home or just in general, even with their relationships. And so it can cause people to just have poor performance and low mood and motivation. And it also has been linked to psychoses, like I said, to some types of mental disorders, and is probably more prevalent. Excuse me, more prevalent in people who already have mental disorders, and so meaning that it can make it worse. There are some treatments for addiction, although those are questionable. And that includes psychotherapy treatment, which is basically meeting with the psychotherapist to help with motivation and cognitive behavior. There's also drug therapy substitution, which means you just basically take one drug for another, which is less harmful. And some of those are dronabinol and abalone, but there's no evidence that these treatments are really effective. However, they still exist. Okay, so I'm just going to switch gears a little bit to talk about another form of marijuana, which is a lab-made marijuana, synthetic marijuana, which mimics the effects of THC. And so again, this is just chemically made. It can be found to be 4 to 100 times stronger than marijuana, which you would find in plants. It's deceptively marketed as incense or herbal smoke, and it's been produced since the early 2000s. You can easily buy it on the internet in head shops and convenience stores, and it's sold under names such as K2, K3, Legal, Spice, Sin, Haze, and Cloud9. The route of administration is smoked by wrapping it in joints, in pipes, or inhaling the fumes by vaporizers. The issue with synthetic marijuana is that it's not FDA approved, and it's actually it has worse side effects, let's say, than regular marijuana. And so those side effects can be paranoid delusions, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, psychosis, severe agitation, inability to feel pain, hallucinations, and total memory loss. And you can compare these side effects to marijuana, which are somewhat the same, except that the synthetic cannabinoids actually just have worse side effects in general. The K2 Spice synthetic marijuana is marketed as an herbal incense, but yet it's more of a hallucinogen, and so it's way more dangerous than marijuana. One of the dangerous side effects is something that's called cough lock, which is the inability to move despite being conscious, and so you're just completely like catatonic, like you're kind of just paralyzed, but yet you're conscious. And in some cases, it causes loss of consciousness, paranoia, and psychotic episodes. So, the synthetic cannabis is also a psychoactive drug, meaning that it affects the central nervous system. And 5 of the common chemicals used to make the synthetic marijuana became Schedule 1. So, it's a pretty dangerous drug. And now some of these compounds have been used to make a new drug called bath salts. And so bath salts are even much more harmful than marijuana. And the side effects are much more severe as well. For the last part of this lecture, I'm going to go over synthetic cathinones, which are also known as bath salts, MDPV, and CAT. And so these type of drugs function as dopamine, norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. I know that's a big long word, but what it means is that this kind of drug prevents dopamine from being degraded by enzymes. So that leaves a whole bunch of more dopamine left at the synaptic cleft so that it can stimulate the neurons. And so we already know that having a lot of dopamine around or increasing dopamine is the reason why a lot of people have an addiction to a drug, because dopamine affects the reward center. And so it's 4 times more potent than Ritalin or Concerta. The duration of action is about 3 to 4 hours, and the after effects last as long as 6 to 8 hours. Amateur chemists change the chemical composition of the bath salt and make it nearly impossible for regulation to keep up with the production. If you want to learn more about it, go ahead and click on this link and you can watch some YouTube videos regarding this. The mortality rate for this type of drug, it's very has very heavy side effects, and so it's just not a good drug. The mortality rate is anywhere from 8 to 14% of people who use it. People normally develop an elevated temperature, agitated behavior, delirium. Some have this zombie like behavior. I mean, literally. If you read this article here, it says that a person who was basically on bath salts chewed off the face of another man. Isn't that crazy? And yeah, and so this is just so potent that he basically just kind of lost it. And so it can lead to elevated temperature, agitated delirium, respiratory arrest, and then death. Um, so treatment for this type of addiction so far is just benzodiazepines. But there's no real treatments or not much is done with this type of drug since it's one of the more newer ones that are out there. And so for we're going to have a small write up about a drug that hasn't been discussed in class. And this one actually qualifies since I don't have that much information. So if any of you want to choose bath salts and want to do a little bit more research on it, that would be great. So this is the end of this lecture, and we have just 2 more chapters to cover in the next following weeks.